Now, aside from mob trials, I go to other federal trials, like this one, John Burge. John Burge was retired down in Florida, enjoying his pension from the Chicago Police Department, and he got a knock on the door one day by two FBI agents. They started asking him questions about the alleged torture and abuse back in the 80s when he was commander, and he lied to the FBI. They charged him with one count of lying to the FBI. Now, here's one of the worst men I've ever laid eyes on. Ex-Commander John Burge. Him and his crew allegedly tortured over 100 innocent young black men into confessing to murders and other serious crimes they did not commit. I watched him in court with no remorse at all, only supported there by his brother. Now several victims in the John Burge case took the stand as older men testified how they spent the past 30, 40 years in prison for crimes they did not commit. In this room, they were deprived of food, their attorney, they were beaten, choked, burnt, tortured into confessing to crimes they did not commit. And the victim said they smelled alcohol on the cop's breath. Now, one of John Burge's favorite torture tactics was electric shock. This is something he learned in Vietnam. As an MP soldier, he used to torture the Viet Cong. Some of the victims testified that they would get them down in a chair, put alligator clips on their balls, their nipples, and their ears, and that John Burge, laughing, would crank a box, shocking them into confessing. There's another victim of John Burge. He testified that when he was a young man in his early 20s, they got him, brought him into an interrogation room where they hung him by his thumbs out the window 11 stories up. They also took a typewriter cover, threw it around his head, and nearly choked him to death, all beating him with phone books. He testified that the cops had alcohol in their breath. Here's another victim of John Burge. All the victims got on the stand and told a very similar story. There was a pattern in their testimony. They testified that as young men in their early 20s, they were beaten, tortured, burnt, choked, and falsely confessing to crimes they did not commit. They spent most of their life, 30, 40 years in prison, only to be freed by DNA years later. Here's Honorable Judge Joan Lefkoe, who I used to see quite a bit at the Dirksen Federal Building. She was one of the judges that presided over the John Burge trial. At first, I thought she might be a little lenient on the defendant, but that wasn't the case at all. And years later, tragically, her husband was tragically killed in front of her home on the North Shore. Now, we all know this guy, ex-mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. And during most of the court cases where these young black men were convicted for crimes they did not commit, Daley was the assistant state's attorney. He prosecuted many of these cases. He obviously had to know these guys were innocent, yet he did nothing and was never charged for it. Now, in this case, unfortunately, they couldn't charge John Burge and the police officers underneath him with any of the abuse. But they did, luckily, were able to charge John Burge with one count for lying to the FBI. He only served 4.5 years. And let's all hope and pray that he suffers for the crimes he's committed to these innocent men.